In this series, we're talking about pausing and creating intentional space in different areas of our lives. In other words, we're talking about taking time to breathe or to create a sense of breathing room in life. Have you ever noticed how when you're calm and relaxed, your breathing is slow and normal? But when you're stressed out, anxious, or nervous, you have shortness of breath. Recently, I read an article entitled "Breathing Rhythms Can Affect Your Emotions," and it said this: when we breathe normally, the body maintains a healthy balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide. However, when we start to feel anxious, we may breathe too much or too little, and this balance gets out of whack. When we breathe too much, also known as hyperventilating, less oxygen makes its way to the brain, and we experience many unpleasant sensations. This explains why we felt like we couldn't breathe when we had to stand in front of classmates and give a presentation in elementary school. When we think about it, it's fascinating how breathing and emotions are connected. Emotions are an important part of our lives. The same article talks about how actually feeling our emotions is much healthier for our mental and physical well-being. There may be some of you who do this when you feel your emotions. In fact, maybe you'd say that you feel all the emotions. On the other hand, maybe some of you would say that you're a thinker, not a feeler. Logic is always the answer. I mean, always. Maybe you suppress your feelings. Maybe you tell yourself things like, just deal with it, or you're fine. Or maybe you try to numb your feelings by turning to something that will distract you from thinking about them. Think about it this way. How would your kids say that you handle your emotions? If you don't have kids, how about your coworkers or your parents or your siblings? Do you blow up when you're angry and get it all out? Or do you let your kids suffer from your silent treatment while you keep it all in? Whether you're a thinker or a feeler, here are some truths about all of us. Number one, we all have emotions. You may think I'm not emotional, but most of those thoughts and mental responses that bounce around in your brain have an emotion that is attached to them. Number two, physical growth and mental development happen automatically, but emotional development requires a choice. We have to make a decision that we want to be healthy emotionally. Number three, what you don't work out, you will act out. Those emotions that we all have, they'll make their way out of us eventually in some form or fashion. We'll either process them in a healthy way or we won't. Instead of having good emotional margin, we often live in reaction to stress. Up until a couple of years ago, this is how I lived most of my adult life. The symptoms of no emotional margin are, we're scattered. We can't focus on or finish projects. We're stuck. We live in uncertainty and fear. We're freaked out. We live on the edge of our nerves, and we're powerless. We feel overwhelmed and inept. We're numb. We feel empty and just plain and simply blah. I accidentally stumbled upon a group of people who helped me realize this and modeled for me a healthy way of dealing with many of my emotions. And that's what I want for you too, to be thinkers and feelers. Let's be healthy thinkers and healthy feelers, both at the same time. In order to do that, we need emotional margin. We need to let our emotions breathe. But how do we do that when the world that we live in doesn't leave much room for that? In the New Testament of the Bible, we learn all about the life of Jesus when he was here on earth. The first 4 books of the New Testament, which are called the Gospels, they chronicled his life and his teachings. In the Gospel of John, John records a dramatic event in Jesus' life. Jesus' friend, Lazarus, had died, and Lazarus' sister, Martha, confronted Jesus. Jesus was known throughout the region for performing miracles, so it stands to reason he could have healed Lazarus and prevented his death. So Martha was upset and had some questions for Jesus, like, where were you? Why did it take so long for you to get here? And how could you let this happen to my brother? One may see this questioning and think, wow, is that even allowed? Can someone express emotion to Jesus in that way? Will he lose his temper? Will he lecture her? Will he put her in her place, ignore her, or just tell her to just plain and simply trust God? Not even close. Don't miss this. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come a long way were also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" Look at how Jesus got in the middle of that emotion. Jesus was deeply moved in spirit. Jesus was troubled, and Jesus wept. Jesus felt all his emotions, and he felt them in a deep way. It's part of who he was as a man, and it's part of who we are. Our emotions are God's invention. They're a healthy, normal part of our lives. And when we feel our emotions, Jesus is right there with us, feeling them too. The wise King Solomon wrote about emotions in the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. He said this, "For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under heaven, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance." Solomon was saying that there's a time for all kinds of different emotions. He was also saying this, emotional health means having the appropriate emotional responses at the right times. Sometimes we operate in extremes, and some of us are all about the laughing and the dancing. As for the other stuff, we act like it doesn't exist. Some of us only cry and grieve. Some of us feel our emotions, but only the sad ones. Having emotional margin is recognizing that there is some good and some bad, some happy and some sad, some positive and some negative in our lives and in this world. Some seasons are peaceful and blessed, and some seasons are just plain difficult. Some days are good, some days are bad, and most days contain both. It doesn't make sense for us to avoid the laughing or the crying, but we also don't need to live in either of those extremes. This is what children do, and this is where we have to make the choice to develop. There's a famous love chapter in 1 Corinthians, a New Testament letter that was written by the Apostle Paul. And in the midst of the chapter, Paul made this interesting statement. "When I was a child, I spoke and thought and reasoned as a child. But when I grew up, I put away childish things." Gary Smalley was an author who addressed family relationships from a Christian perspective. He candidly admits that he didn't grow up until he was in his 40s. And he said this, "In many ways, I remained a child until I was in my 40s. Until that time, I looked to my bosses and my church to take care of me. I'd whine and complain if they didn't seem to care about what I wanted. I'd go home and tell my wife that they weren't being sensitive to me. I depended on them and my family to make me happy until I finally took personal responsibility for my life. Only then did I start to grow up, and it didn't happen overnight." In the same way, in order for you and I to have healthy emotional space for emotions to breathe, we have to take responsibility for them. We have to grow up. So what does that mean? Having emotional margin means coming to the place where we have emotional balance. We're healthy, we're not living on the edge of our emotional limit. You see, Jesus was emotional with Martha. He was troubled and he wept. At the same time, though, he was also faithful and steadfast. He was present, but he wasn't out of control. Emotions are a gift. They can keep us safe, healthy, and connected. They're the light on the dashboard, but sometimes we ignore the dashboard for so long that we don't know that the car isn't working properly. It leaves a trail of hurt that we're kind of unaware of, and it affects other people. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus said this, "For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come." If we ignore our heart, there will be a trickle-down effect. We can function and suppress, but eventually there will be a bigger problem. Our heart says, if you won't take time for joy, I'll find counterfeit joy. If you won't cultivate real intimacy, I'll find a false intimacy. If you ignore me, I will find love however I can. When we get busy, our hearts dry up, and we desperately look for life anywhere. That's why we need time to breathe. If we're not good stewards of our emotions, we can explode, get depressed, withdrawn, or stressed out. People sometimes say to me, "I can't help it." I say to them, if you can't, then who can? If you aren't responsible for your emotions, then who is? We won't really love well or connect deeply. We may feel at some level, but if we're not comfortable feeling our own emotions, we probably won't be great at expressing them to the people that we love. On the other hand, if we're emotional to an extreme level, our emotions will become bigger than everything else. There's no space for relationships. That's why we need space for our emotions to simply breathe. Enough bad news. Here's the good news. God is ready to help us in this area. He can and He will. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus said this, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." This is the invitation of Jesus. Come to me, and I will give you rest. Jesus invites us to bring Him all of our emotions. Here are two simple takeaways in light of what we've talked about today. First, be honest. Get quiet. Breathe and ask God to help you feel your emotions. He is able to handle your emotions, every single one of them. Even if you've stuffed them down for 40 years, He can handle it. Allow yourself to feel the full weight of your feelings without censoring. Ask, what am I feeling? Where am I emotionally unhealthy? What am I hoping for? Where am I disappointed? How am I really doing? One of the main ways that God loves us is through other people. So it may be a good idea for you to talk about your emotions with someone else. Maybe a trusted friend, or maybe a counselor. Sometimes they can even help you identify the emotions you're feeling that you weren't even aware of. Here's the cool part. As you begin to be honest, you'll start to come alive. You'll discover God's love and grace in brand new ways. And then take those emotions to Jesus. Run to Jesus and ask Him for healing. That's a great place for Him to meet us right in the middle of our emotions. In the book of Psalms, David wrote this, "O Lord, you have examined my heart and know everything about me. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts, even when I'm far away." You see, God made us. He understands us. You won't shock Him by telling Him how you actually feel. Tell Him that you want to establish healthy emotional patterns, that you want to grow up in this area. You see, this will be a daily choice, but He'll be right there with you every step of the way. Enjoy the presence of God. Understand that just because you feel something, it doesn't mean that you have to follow it. Don't shame yourself for having emotions. Remember, feeling those emotions and processing them in a healthy way will allow you to experience more joy and love others in a way more connected way. Jesus felt emotion and He expressed it. So did King David and King Solomon. The Bible is full of emotion expressed by the authors. God invented emotions. It's a God-given part of who we are. But it's also a place where we need to breathe, take a pause, pay attention to our hearts, and be honest. Just know that the God who knows everything about us is always ready to hear what we're feeling and feel it with us. Jesus invites us to bring Him our emotions. It's part of how we learn to let our emotions breathe.